Please stand for the reading of the word. First reading comes from the book of Exodus, chapter 20, verse 8. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. The second reading, the book of Mark, Mark 2, chapter 2, verses 23 through 28. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as his disciples walked along, they began to pick some heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" He answered, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? In the days of Abiathar, the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for priests to eat. And he also gave some to his companions. Then he said to them, 'The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath.'" May the Lord bless the reading of these words. Did you hear? Jesus is in town.
What? How did I not get that memo?
I hear there's even going to be a parade.
Yeah, not sure that's gonna work this morning. Where is it?
All the way out by the city gate.
Oh my. That's just so hard to get everything in these days, but I know it will be quite the event.
Well, he'll probably be back through here soon. Maybe next time.
After the children's sermon, I've decided to forego any jokes that there might be. At least for this week. According to Jewish tradition, there are 613 commandments in the first 5 books of the Bible. In the 12th century, the famous Rabbi Maimonides took on the task of making a list of them, observing that they fall into 2 categories: positive commandments and negative commandments. As you can imagine, the positive ones are the things we're supposed to do. The negative ones are the things we're not supposed to do. Now, of these commandments, 365 are positive commandments, a number that corresponds to the days of our solar year. And the remaining 248 are negative, which, according to Jewish tradition, corresponds to the number of bones and main organs in the human body. Now, there are 206 bones in the body, and just how many of our organs could be considered as main ones is open to interpretation. Needless to say, the rabbis weren't surgeons, they weren't medical doctors, but their point was that the purpose of the commandments was to maintain harmony between heaven and earth. Even larger, the point being made is that the commandments were not meant to restrict human life. In fact, the opposite is true. Even the restrictions were meant to create fullness of life. Now, I confess that my memory isn't what it used to be, especially when it comes to following instructions. I find that I have to look again and again. But we can take comfort in knowing that God created us a cheat sheet of sorts that's found both in Deuteronomy and Exodus. You see, he narrowed down those 613 commandments to just 10, from which the rest of the commandments flow. So this isn't a joke. I am kind of serious here. Can you name all 10 commandments? And could you do it in order? No. Some of you might be able to, and that's great. We're not going to put anybody on the spot, but I'm going to remind you what they are in order. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself any idols or carved images. You shall not take the name of the Lord in vain. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Honor your father and your mother. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. In other words, don't lie. And you shall not covet your neighbor's house, your neighbor's wife, or anything else that belongs to your neighbor. Now, of the above list, the first 5 are understood in Christian tradition to be the basic ways that we act on our love for God, which includes in those first 5, honor your father and your mother. The second 5 have to do with how we act out our love for our neighbor. And taken together, they're about how we respond to God's love, which is given to us. It embraces us before we ever know we need it. As John Wesley called that, prevenient grace, the love of God that he shares with us before we ever know that we need it. Now, regardless of how many commandments we can recite, in modern America, not all of them are commonly considered to be true commandments. In practice, at least one is considered purely optional, more like a suggestion than a commandment. And you're already way ahead of me. You know which one I'm going to talk about. Number 4, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Just this week I read this statement. It gave me pause to think. Violating the Sabbath is the only sin we brag about. It's the one that starts with, I am so busy, I have no time to even think about rest. By and large, while America may slow down a bit on the weekends, very few of us treat any single day of the week with the reverence intended for it in the Bible. No day of the week is dedicated in its entirety to connecting with God. And lest you think I'm stepping on toes, let me just say I am up here dancing like crazy. We may pause for an hour or two at church on Sunday, but then it's off to the races again. Because I got to tell you, I know what all I've got to do this afternoon. We may even appeal to Jesus' example from our reading this morning to exempt our behavior. Didn't Jesus say the Sabbath was made for humankind, not humankind for the Sabbath? Did Jesus really mean we can do anything we please on the Sabbath because it was made for us? No. No. The only thing about Sabbath keeping that Jesus sought to do away with was the petty legalism that surrounded it in his day. You see, the rabbis, they came up with a lot of rules in order to follow, in order to not even come close to breaking one of the laws. It was like building a fence around that law that made up of so many requirements that you had to break a whole bunch of little laws before you would even come close to breaking the main law. One of the Sabbath rules was that you weren't supposed to work on the Sabbath. And so there were many, 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 many rules that defined what work was, what was permissible, and what was not. Like, for instance, they even had it down to how many steps you could take in order to feed and water your livestock on the Sabbath before it became work instead of something that was necessary to do. Now, does that sound a little bit extreme? Just a little. Do you know we engage in the same kind of behavior? How many of you have ever told your kids to stay away from the stove? Don't go near the stove. If you go near the stove, you're going to get burned. Don't go near the stove, whether it's on or whether it isn't. In Jesus' day, the rabbis had created so many requirements in an effort to keep people away from the hot stove of Sabbath breaking that Sabbath keeping had become a cold routine rather than a spiritual practice. In other words, people saw it as a whole bunch of rules and not the life-giving thing that it was intended to be. The original intent behind Sabbath keeping was simple. It was a time for being, not doing. All right, y'all. How many of you have a hard time just being? Anybody? Yeah. Just being? Just doing nothing at all? One disconnected from one's daily business in order to reconnect with God, one's family, one's neighbor, and the earth. This disconnection and reconnection ensured that each week, people would have a chance to glimpse the forest from the trees, to step out of the fray, to pull back a bit, to see life's seasonality. You're all looking at me with such expectant faces. What is she going to say next? What is this all about? It also ensured that people would not succumb to the notion that the world revolves around them and what they do. Taking this Sabbath sensibility into the rest of the week, people would be free from becoming slaves to their own self-importance. I'm dancing like crazy up here. So what then are we supposed to do when we take Sabbath time, whether that is a Sunday or some other day of the week, because Sunday doesn't work out for everybody. Really isn't so much that it has to be Sunday as it is some day of the week to take time to spend time with God. The basic principle of Sabbath is to pray, P-R-A-Y, and to play, P-L-A-Y. On the Sabbath, we are to rest, reflect, give thanks to God, and to have fun. Now, who would guess today that God would put such a high value on having fun? And isn't it strange that we have such a difficult time with this particular commandment? How is it that God would command us to have fun? See, it isn't God's idea that we stay busy 24/7, and that it isn't what God's rules are about. As each of the 10 Commandments was meant to connect us with a God who desires and derives great joy from creation. Pastor told a story about one of his parishioners, a younger person coming to see him, who said that he thought that the God of the Old Testament, that God was more concerned with rules than with love, as evidenced by the 10 Commandments. And the pastor expressed to this parishioner that the 10 Commandments were given to us to protect us. He explained that he struggled with the commandment not to covet, that even though he was perfectly happy in the church where he served, he found himself jealous or covetous of his colleagues who were serving better churches, in his opinion. And after a while, the pastor said that his heart and his head got so divided that he wasn't serving God or his church the way he wanted to. He had discovered that the hard way, that the human heart cannot attach itself to two different desires for very long without breaking. The commandment against coveting was not to repress the human desire to have things, but to nourish and preserve the joy with what we do have. How can you really enjoy what you do have when you look around to see what everybody else has and wonder why you don't have it too? The 10 Commandments seem to be considered equally serious. By that I mean, no one commandment is necessarily more important than the other. You have to take them all together. It means that Sabbath keeping is as important as refraining from coveting, or stealing, or lying, or murder. And what this should tell us is that each commandment equally protects us from misery. If we think that failing to keep the Sabbath could possibly do the equivalent damage as murder, then I would ask you to consider who an excessively busy person is killing, or how they may be killing a relationship. To put it bluntly, we can break the Sabbath all we want, and God won't come after us with a hammer or a lightning bolt. But just as the pastor who was coveting his friend's better appointments found, he was in a collision course with his own seductions. He came close to losing everything because of his desire for something that wasn't his to have. And where the Sabbath commandment is concerned, our hearts begin to believe that we are defined by what we do and produce and consume. And before long, we feel as though we can't stop to rest because the weight of the world is on our shoulders. To put it even more bluntly, each week that we fail to set aside a full day for playing and praying and resting, we essentially send out a signal to God that we consider ourselves and what we are doing more important than God and what God is doing. If you're not ouching in your soul right this moment, then you are keeping Sabbath every single week. You may have wondered what this has to do with Palm Sunday. All through Lent, we've been talking about making time, making space, making room for God in our lives. We have talked about what we've needed to let go of or clear out so that we could spend quality time with God. The last week of Jesus' life on earth, he made time to spend with God. He didn't just keep the rules, he lived into the meaning behind the rules. Now, he very well could have said to God, listen, there is so much more that I need to do here. I don't have time to waste on this Passover celebration. But he didn't. Because he was faithful to all of God's commandments, he was able to pray, not my will, but yours be done, in the Garden of Gethsemane the night before his death. Because he kept all of the commandments, he was able to keep all of his faith, even to the very end. My prayer for us this day and leading to Easter Sunday is that we are not so busy that we skip over time to pray and to play. That we would take time to disconnect from a frantic and chaotic schedule, to reconnect with God, family, neighbor, and the earth, to take time to rest in God. That means to do something other than clean house. That means to do something other than mow the yard, unless mowing the yard is your form of play. It means doing something other than running errands. It means something other than getting that one more thing done. It means taking time to connect with God, to pray, to think, to play, to have lunch with a friend, to enjoy your hobby, to go for a walk, to rest, to give it a rest just for a day. And if we do it this week, that we will make it a weekly practice, not because it's a rule, but to help us live into the fullness that God intended for us to live. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.